I'm Rebecca Strelick. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia, Bucks County. The town I lived in was called Holland. I was born in Illinois, actually. I moved there when I was 6. I went to school at Tyler School of Art, which is Temple University's art college. I went there for both my undergraduate and graduate degree. So I hold a BFA in metals, jewelry, and CAD/CAM. And then I also have an MFA from that school. I'm not supposed to really be here at all, right? Like, I'm not coming out of computer science. I'm not coming out of animation or industry. I am a fine artist, right? So I really have no business being at SIGGRAPH, except that I just happen to use computer aided design and 3D printing in my work. I was in a class at Tyler School of Art. Kim Voigt, who is a longtime SIGGRAPHer, mostly doing her volunteering through the studio, which was the Gorilla Studio, then the studio, and has evolved to something else now completely. She was kind of OG studio, and she mentioned it and she was like, you should totally come. At this point, I was in my final year of graduate school. Like, I wanted to finish grad school and go right into teaching, hopefully a tenure track position. And Kim and I and another person, Makai Smith, submitted some content to get into the conference. Simultaneously, I did get a job. I got a tenure track job at Penn State University at their Altoona College. I immediately had to publish or perish. And in the art world, that is exhibit or die. I was looking for all kinds of opportunities to share my work with the world, to get all those bylines. I submitted work to the SIGGRAPH Art Gallery, having never heard of it before. It was just not on the radar of the work that I was looking at or that the discipline I was a part of. We were mostly showing in small contemporary craft galleries. So I got in. I get in on my first shot, which was wild. And so now all of a sudden Penn State is going to pay for me to go. So I went to my first SIGGRAPH fully funded, which is a lovely way to go. You're not thinking about budget. You're just doing everything all at once. The rest is the same story you'll hear from a lot of us, which is I went to my first SIGGRAPH and then I had to find a way to come back every year after. And so I was constantly seeking for the next project. So that was 2003. 2004, I was on a subcommittee in the studio. 2005, I was a subcommittee member. 2006, I was the lead of the 3D printing space. And then I interviewed with Joe Marks to be on his committee. So Joe Marks was the 2007 SIGGRAPH conference chair. And I was selected to be the Gorilla Studio chair in 2007. That was a huge job. And once you get behind the curtain of how to plan a conference, then lots of doors start opening if you want to walk through them. It was probably right around then that people like Cindy Stark, Bob Niehaus, Francesca Regan, people were coming up to me and so you're going to be conference chair? And I was like, let me do this first. I got to get through this thing. It wasn't on my to-do list. It looked like a massive job that I did not have the skills for. And there was a major reorg in the conference led by Ronan Barzell and Jacqueline Martino. And those two conferences, 2008 and 2009, that's when we had the advent of general submissions and these more thematic, overarching umbrella submission ideas that a piece of content doesn't have to fit neatly into one size box. I became a new position, which no longer exists, but it was art sphere director. I was the person that went over the art gallery, art papers, and the Gorilla Studio. So I helped kind of wrangle those folks. In 2010-ish, I interviewed to be the 2012 conference chair. And I got that gig. So I was simultaneously doing things for 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. And then I was also simultaneously getting ready for that conference. So I was shadowing conference chairs. So that whole process is a huge blur because I was so nervous. But it was in person. This is pre-pandemic, right? So everything was in person. You flew to all these meetings and they were lovely. So intense and so productive. You get all these smart people in a room and you get so much accomplished over a weekend. The people I remember being there were Bob Niehaus and Jackie White and Cindy Stark and the current named conference chair. So that would have been Pete Braccio from 11, Terrence Masson from 10, Jacqueline Ronan. There would have been an EC rep there, but I can't remember who it was at this point. It could have been Tony Bayless or Jeff Joyner might have been there. I remember it being in a West Coast city, the meeting, and I remember it being sunny. There were big windows and we're at a big long table and I was at the very end. My thing I was most afraid about is that they were going to ask me about managing $1 million budgets. I'm a fine artist and I'm an art professor. While I've been very adept at managing my own budget and my own research agenda budget, I have not managed anything in the realms of I think my budget was in the multi-millions. So afraid that they were going to ask me about that. And they, of course they did. And I just was totally honest. And I was like, I will do the best I can. The contractors that exist in SIGGRAPH is something so unusual to me. I've been involved in lots of other conferences and events. You have not only just a safety net, you have 6. You have this big wide one with big holes, and then you have a small, it's like this graduating, they get smaller and smaller until eventually they just set you very gently down on the ground. If you show up and you do all the things you say you're going to do, you can't mess up. It's such a lovely feeling to be that supported. And I feel like that's where I learned the most, is interacting with the contractors. I have a little bit of imposter syndrome when it comes to SIGGRAPH. Like I've never fit neatly into any of the categories. Because when you say artist at SIGGRAPH, that can mean 10 different things. And I am like the 11th. It all started from our identity, like our graphic identity, which used to be a very big thing with SIGGRAPH. Like every year, I know it sounds small now, but the merch and what you take back home with you and what it looked like was wrapped up in the whole identity of the conference. And it's different now. And I agree with why it's different now. I think we do need to move into a place where that isn't such a focus. My conference had 21,212 people. Like, so we were still a pretty sizable conference then. People want stuff. They want to take stuff home. And so a lot of what we decided very early on in working with Q, which was our design firm at the time, and Todd Szymanski, the very first, we decided we were going to carry this through for a few years. And so MK Haley agreed. I believe MK was right after me. This idea that you were either art or science. Like, I am art or I am science. I am left brain, I have right brain. You might remember this imagery, but it was this idea that not necessarily the binary, like you have to pick, but this idea that we are all these groups and we're all coming from different places. When I bring students to the conference, I tell them this. I say, look, the scheduled content is amazing. Like, you will find nothing better. But what you can't find anywhere else in the world is the hallways, like the bars, the restaurants, the sidewalk, the people you run into that you will not in your daily goings on, and you will meet them and you will realize that you have synergies you could have never imagined. And then making that connection leads to others and others. And so it's this idea that if you walked around with this badge that says, I am art, and then you meet someone that says, I am science, the first thing we start talking about is like how we are the same, which is so prevalent. Like the hypothesis, the investigation, the experimentation, they're all exactly the same right until the very end when our audience changes. And so I just love this idea that the whole theme, the whole idea of the conference was to identify, to say who you are because you're welcome, and to like raise your hand so other people can find you and that you can meet people that are different. And I was really proud of that. It felt very forward looking at the time, very graphically strong. I feel like people in the arts, and I mean like people who identify, I am an artist, right? These conversations always exist because most of what we're investigating is the personal, or is the identification of oneself or a group of people or a place. To then look across the table at someone like Joe Marks or someone like Ronan Barzell, Scott Owen, who I call friends. Like, never, ever in any other context would we be spending this much time together. I brought preconceived notions of what they think of me, which were never founded, which I love. Like, I was never questioned in my authority. I was never told, oh, you're just an artist. It was the opposite. They were drawing me out in ways that I didn't know I was capable of, because they're like, we need you. I think the healthy thing to do is for a conference chair to like finish. It usually takes about a year after to wrap everything up, so you're still involved on the CAG, and to like step away. Like, I think that's the healthy thing. And the thing I did is then I became the conference advisory group chair. So like, I then went right into a role supporting the future conference chairs, which I loved. And I was following up Jackie White, who is now no longer with us, and the world is a worse place for it, for in all kinds of ways. Taught me so much about grace and listening, and how like it's a marathon, not a sprint, with big organizations like SIGGRAPH. Anytime I'm faced with something where I'm like, okay, it truly is a what would Jackie do situation in my life. And I'm internally grateful for that. I'd call her like late on a Tuesday. I'd be like, oh my gosh, like, what do I do about this thing the EC said? And she's like, well, let me check. And then she'd pull out emails from like 1996 and 2001. And she's like, we talked about it this way on this date and this way on this date. And I'm like, of course we did. Thank you. The keeper of the stories she was. I wanted to stay around for people like Jackie. I want to stay around to contribute, because she was so great as the CAG chair when I was coming up as a conference chair. And I wanted to give that to other conference chairs as well. And I think I was able to do that.
Every year as Pioneers Chair, one of the things that I've been doing is creating an in memoriam video. Last year, obviously, Jackie was a big part of that. We followed that up actually at last year's conference. We actually had a little in memoriam gathering.
I was there just for
you were there.
Bit.
Well,
yeah.
Well, then that's where we met, because we were sitting in that little room together.
Yeah. I didn't stay very long. Last year, I mean, talking about wearing different hats, last year I was live stream reporter live from SIGGRAPH in the beautiful Vancouver Convention Center. Right. That was me. And so my time was occupied in very weird ways last year. Like, I didn't see much. I showed up for just a short amount of time at the beginning and I had to run. but I do remember that. Thank you for doing it.
And her family
Oh
was
my gosh.
there, which was really nice.
Yes, Christopher and his, yes, absolutely. It was such a pivotal moment in my life personally because my first child was born in March of 2011. Everything was like planned around me and my pregnancy. A meeting that we had planned early on had to be switched to somewhere I could drive to because I was then told I wasn't allowed to fly anymore. I mean, it just, the whole thing kind of revolved around newness. This new human was arriving, but also just all these new things for me professionally. And for some history, and people won't know this necessarily if you weren't in the room. So there was the big economic crisis in 2008. I very clearly remember being in a meeting, a CAG meeting, where I was newly named the conference chair and we were deciding on cities. Like we were talking in the very beginnings of what city would be when. And we had this multi-year deal for Los Angeles. We could arrange those dates if need be. And so we would often stagger them in interesting ways if something else came up. And so like the Vancouver opportunity in 11, for instance, I think originally was supposed to be an LA year, but then we changed it when that became a reality. We didn't know how Vancouver was going to do. And so everyone was operating that it was just going to be a disaster. Like we were being really conservative because we didn't know if anyone would come, right? We just didn't know. And it was a massive success, of course, but we couldn't see through that crystal ball in a meaningful way. But I remember being in a CAG meeting and I'm all excited. I'm new. Like I can't wait to get started. And then this phrase was uttered, like, if there's a 2012, like if financially we're even able to have your conference. And I was like, wait, what? Like that's the biggest bait and switch I've ever heard. Like we're having this conference. Each year's conference is so dependent on the ones on either side of it as far as budgeting and planning, and no one conference chair can just like lay down a law unless it's like selecting desserts at the dessert reception. Like there really isn't anything strategic I could have done all on my own. And that's really smart because it means like no one can really go rogue and we're always building on the history. I didn't really change the course of much because I was still busy trying to make sure I was building on the reorg that happened in 8 and 9, make sure we were following the trajectory of all those great changes that were implemented by Jacqueline and Ronan. It was really more about doing things that SIGGRAPHers loved so that we made an event that they couldn't miss. Things like we screened the Curiosity rover landing in the convention center. Everyone was convinced there was no way that was going to work. Like seeing the render, like the animation of how this machine had to operate in order to actually physically survive a landing seemed a little impossible. And when it worked, it was like, yeah, of course it did. Like here at SIGGRAPH 2012, like of course it's happening now with all these people, some of which whom probably worked on this project, like are in the room cheering. That spectacle, that novelty, like MK Haley talks about it in such an amazing way. And I think it's from her time in Imagineering and being in these meetings where, you know, her Disney colleagues would be like, what is the light that attracts you to it? And so we were trying to make lots of those, recognizing it had been a hard couple of years for people, right? And we were back in LA and we were trying to build on that momentum and it worked. I mean, it was a super successful conference. We had more exhibitors than we had for a while, way more attendees, but the content, I didn't see any of it. Like I saw the keynote because I had to introduce her. That was Jane McGonigal. She wrote her book, Reality is Broken. You might remember.
It's on my bookshelf back there.
Perfect.
I got her to autograph it that year.
And the line was, I mean, at one point, I remember saying to Fran, I'm like, what are we going to do? Like, she's only supposed to be here for an hour. Like, there's way more people than an hour's. And I remember like leaning down, I'm like, Jane, she's like, I'll stay. Just get someone at the end of the line now and say you're the last person and I'll stay till they're all done. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Like this SIGGRAPH keynote it's a weird thing because not everyone goes to that session, right? That session was really for members. We were honoring the award winners. The president was speaking, the SIGGRAPH president. Like, so at that point, half of our attendees turned over every year. Half of us were new. They had no idea that they needed to get up and go to this important session. They were too worried about the production session they might not get a seat for. It's always been an interesting thing to plan. And I think in recent conferences, they've been doing a good job with having like 3 featured speakers that will kind of address the needs and desires of certain people instead of trying to pick this one monumental person that's going to represent everyone. That's impossible. The thing that was different was that I fought really hard for paying her because up until that point, there was like an unwritten law that no one could cite policy for, but that we didn't pay keynote speakers. So they were always people we were pulling on connects. Like, I know this person, or that person was my graduate thesis advisor, so I can ask them to do it. And we were getting amazing people, don't get me wrong, but it was often an insider, someone who was already going to be there or knows about us. And Jane was not one of those. It was not something she would have attended regularly. And so her book was so timely. And at this point, gaming is booming, and it just made sense. Like, we were missing the mark at SIGGRAPH in terms of bringing in the gamers. And I feel like having her showed that if we invest on the front end and bring in someone, that will bring people, because there were people in attendance that came just because of her. And that was huge. And I agree, her book was amazing and kind of got rid of the stigma that gaming is always bad. It's always bad for your brain. It's bad for your body. It's definitely bad for kids. I mean, she's the first person academically that shifted that idea for me in a way that I felt I could repeat to colleagues and parents and actually have a sound argument. She was super entertaining. I'll never forget, she got a ride from her hotel to the convention center, and we met her at the front door of the LACC, and she got out of her car, and I was like, is that her? That's her. It's totally her. And she's coming to the door with these huge fuzzy slippers on. Like, she's all dressed, but she has these, like, I mean, they were humongous, like something you'd wear only in your house. These huge, I think they were pink. They're either powder blue or baby pink, and they were like fuzzy. And I was like, I remember saying to Fran, I'm like, do you think she's going to wear those on stage? And Fran's like, I bet not. And she most certainly did not. I hate to focus on her shoes, but she had this velvet bag in her backpack that after her sound check, she pulled out these very nice shoes that were not slippers, but were clearly very uncomfortable. And so she only put them on for the stage, and then they went away again. Yeah. So those are the kinds of memories I remember. As a conference chair, you're doing all the press, you're doing all the EC meetings, you're doing the pre-briefs, the post-briefs. So you have meetings on the bookends of every single day. You have conference management texting you that there was an issue at one of the hotels last night that you need to be aware of, and that someone, there's just a constant every day. It's like damage control and or celebration of something.
As a fine artist, did you have any input into the art show in particular? Did you show any of your work?
That's a great question, because there was a split second where I'm like, ooh, I could affect this in some way. Instead, I chose to put kind of a buffer between it, because it would be very easy for me to get into the weeds of that, because it is my roundhouse. And so I just purposely set that off and delegated in a way that all I got to do was celebrate it. I watched like the technical papers chairs do that over the years as well. You are in charge of this massive important thing, and it would be really easy to set the agenda to align with what you're doing in your lab, for instance. But I have not seen evidence of that because of things like the papers advisory group and the committee at large. And so I was in a way trying to mimic this idea of setting boundaries and expectations that made it so I didn't have control of those things. My mom had come with my husband and I to watch Stella, my daughter, because she was still pretty little. There was a lot of juggling of who has the kid and where are they, because I was still breastfeeding. So we were constantly meeting in hallways so that Stella could get fed, and then I could get back to my job. But it was lovely.
Is that okay to include in
the please, yes, okay. Please do it, because it might encourage another person who breastfeeds to go after that. It would be interesting to take a survey of all the conference chairs of who had small children during the job, because off the top of my head, I can't think of any. And it could just be that I got there a little sooner in terms of age than a lot of people might. It does add a certain level of logistics that they don't ask you about in the interview. You can't be like, are you planning to reproduce during this important time in your life? But I do think that talking about that is huge. I think the job is so much more manageable now. I think for all the things the pandemic did to humanity in the negative column, we are much better at meeting and coming together quickly and converging on ideas with the advent of stuff like this, right? It's the travel, I think, that while it's lovely, don't get me wrong, like SIGGRAPH travel has been one of the best times of my life in all facets, but it's also coming from a small place that doesn't have an international airport. I'm a 2 to 3 hour drive from an airport just to start, right? And so then it's a day every time. And with small kids, that's tricky. I have a second child that came 3 years later, and the same exact thing happened all over again. So my kids have been to several SIGGRAPH as babies, and been passed around, and people make little SIGGRAPH swag for them. And I have all of that. They have several conference badges, even though they're too young to register. It's been a large part of my journey through all of it, to be honest. So yeah, please keep it in. I'd love that. In these interviews, Ed, if you start to find, I'm not tasking you with this because it's going to be a massive job, but that family tree I talked about at the beginning, right? Like Mickey Rose was my student volunteer chair, then the future conference chair, now a CAG chair. I just love this idea that a little whisper of, hey, you're going to be a conference chair, gathers into this idea of this like lifelong service. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, like Scott Owen's a perfect example of that. Like Scott Owen should be long retired from all things SIGGRAPH by now. Like he has put in his time and he continues to raise his hand. And so just to watch that, and I worked with Scott on the org side doing nominations, and then I was nominations chair and he was on the committee with me. And so I worked along with him finding volunteers for the org side of SIGGRAPH, which was a great experience. In all these interviews, we should have a little baby Cindy Stark, like in a window on the bottom with like a buzzer that says, that's not true, this happened in 1982, or that's not true. Like, you know, she's the fact finder, like she knows all. And I feel like it would be so great to have her go through these and be like, well, and then Cindy says in the corner, you know, fixing it a little bit. That institutional knowledge has been, I've been so grateful for all of it. And she's such a dear friend. And her legacy is that she's done it with such ethics and care and consideration that even in times that I know are hard decisions, like I've heard her tell me no. I've heard her say to me as a conference chair, you cannot do that, Rebecca. Please stop asking. It's never about her. It's about the health of everything around her. And she knows next year has to come and we have to be respectful of that person and that committee and that city and those hotels. She just has the bigger picture in mind. We're really lucky. I know she's technically retired, but I bet you she doesn't go away either. Yeah, thank you for doing this. I know it's a lot of work and I appreciate it.